Hi everybody, I'm Dennis. Welcome back to the Bindery. If you've been following along with my beginner bookbinding series, you'll know that this is chapter 3. But if you're here for the first time, worry not. You can find a link to the first 2 installments in the video description. In today's video, we're going to be making a book like this. It's made up of several groups of folded pages with a paper cover, and it's all held together with just thread, no glue whatsoever, which makes it an easy beginner project. In this video, I'll walk you through all the steps of how to make this book, and I'll give you some troubleshooting tips along the way to help keep you on track. I'm sure you'll love the result, so grab your knife and ruler and let's get binding. Before we get started, let's take a look at a few examples of this style of binding. It's described in Keith A. Smith's book, Non-Adhesive Binding, Books Without Paste or Glue, Volume 1. I've got here a few examples that I've made. The main feature, of course, is the exposed sewing, which wraps around the head and tail of the book. I like this feature because it looks a little bit like the headbands on a more traditionally bound book. The stitching goes in and out between the slots in the cover paper, which is just a stiff card or decorative paper, and it's all one piece. The binding is made up of a number of folded signatures, the number of which can vary, though it looks best if you have at least 5 or 6. Smith notes that a spine of at least ½ an inch wide is preferable. Inside, the sewing is pretty simple. There's not a lot of elaborate stitches or knots, and there's no glue in this binding whatsoever. The pages are flush to the cover at the head and tail, and it doesn't need to be trimmed after sewing, which makes it a good project if you don't happen to have a paper cutter. And because there's no glue on the spine, it's very flexible, and the book will open well and lay flat, making it perfect for journals or sketchbooks. Okay, that's enough talking about books. Let's make a book. Here are the materials you're going to need to make this book. A heavy paper for the cover. I'll be using this blue cardstock. A sewing thread in a color of your choice. Generally, a heavier thread looks best. In this case, I'm using this 18-3 linen. You will of course need some paper for your text block. I'm going to use this letter-sized parchment paper. It's 24 pound or 90 GSM and is long grain. I'm going to use 18 sheets, which will make for a finished notebook of 144 pages. As always, I'll be using some beeswax to coat my thread, and I'll be using my usual toolkit of a steel ruler, utility knife, bone folder, an awl, a sewing needle, and to help count out my pages, I'm going to use this little rubber fingertip. I've got myself a new cutting mat to help save my tabletop. If you don't have one of these, then you can use a cutting board or some scrap cardboard to cut upon. Because the size of the folded signatures will determine the size of the cover, we need to first prepare the paper for the text block. I'll count out 18 pages of my paper, and my little rubber fingertip will make that task a little bit easier. Next, the sheets need to be cut in half. I explained how to do this in my previous video on materials. It pays to be careful at this step because the book won't be trimmed after it's sewn, so careful cutting will yield better results for the finished book. With those cut to size, I'll now count out the sheets for the signatures. I'll be making 6 signatures, each one with 6 sheets. As you count out your sheets, place them in a pile in alternating directions to make them easier to handle later. Before folding the signatures, I want to prepare a piece of paper for the cover. To do this, I'm going to take one piece of text block paper to help lay out the cover stock. This paper is now short grain, so I want to make sure that the paper grain of the cover is aligned in the same direction. For the cover, you'll need a piece of paper that's the same height as the text block, and as a minimum, the width of 2 folded signatures, plus the thickness of the text block itself. But because I like to fold over the front and back covers to make inner flaps, I'm going to make my cover 4 times the width of a signature, plus the thickness of the text block. But because I don't actually know the thickness of the text block yet, I'll cut my cover stock extra wide and cut it to precise length later. To lay out my cut, I'll use one of the sheets of paper. I align it with the bottom edge of the cover stock, and then make a small mark with my knife on the other side. Because this cut will be longer than my ruler, I need to make a couple of extra marks. Those will help guide me as I move the ruler to make the cut. Now I simply align my ruler with the layout marks and begin the cut. The trick is to stop cutting partway along, slide the ruler down to the next registration marks, then finish the cut. Before I can cut this to length, I need to determine the thickness of the text block, so it's time to fold the signatures. Because this book won't be trimmed after sewing, it's important to fold the signatures carefully to give a nice finished appearance. Here's a little trick to help you with that. Take your gathering of sheets and tap it against the table to make sure they're all aligned. Pinch them together with one hand and lift that side up and bend them over to the opposite edge or even a bit further. Now, with your other hand, hold down the gathering against the table, then release your first hand and let the sheets come back. This slightly fans out the sheets so that when you finally fold them over, they will ideally fan out equally on either side. Depending on your paper and number of sheets per gathering, this action might need to be repeated before the final crease is made. The goal is to have a signature with a symmetrical chisel-shaped foredge. It can take some practice to get this right, so just try it a few times, checking the foredge as you go before firming down the crease. When done well, this gives a really nice finished appearance to your book. With the signatures folded, it's time to work out the thickness of the text block, which will then dictate the width of the spine portion of the cover. It's tempting to squeeze all the pages together and measure the thickness of the text block like that, but doing so will result in the spine cover being too small. This is because the addition of the sewing thread adds a significant amount of thickness to the book. In bookbinding lingo, this added thickness is called swell, and it can be a bit of a hobgoblin for beginners, so I'll show you a method of estimating swell that works well for this particular style of binding. Pinch the text block together here, about an inch or so back from the spine. This simulates the compression caused by the sewing, yet leaves room for the thread, approximating the swell. I'll then measure the thickness along the back of the signatures. That looks like about 15 millimeters to me. Of course, your book's going to be different based on the type of paper that you're using and the number of sheets per signature, so use your measurement, not mine. As I said before, the width of my cover paper is going to equal 4 times the width of one signature, plus the thickness of the text block which we just measured. Now I could measure everything and do the math, but when I can, I like to avoid measuring at all, so I'm going to use the signatures themselves to do the layout. I'll line up the first signature with the end of the cover, and because I have enough signatures to go around, I'll lay out 3 more. That way, I know that I've got exactly 4 times the width of the text block. To that, I'll add the thickness I measured earlier and make a tick in the paper with my knife. With that marked, I can put my signatures away and trim the cover to length. To do that, I'll measure in from the other end of the paper to my tick mark, make another one here, and trim off the excess. And while I've got this piece of extra paper here, I'm going to cut off a piece from the end to use as my template for piercing the sewing holes later. You may be wondering how I'm going to get the spine portion of the cover precisely in the center of this paper. Well, it's really actually quite easy. Keeping in mind the thickness of the spine, which we just measured, I'm going to take my ruler and set it at that measurement in from one end of the cover paper. Then it's simply a matter of bringing the cover up from the other side, placing it against the ruler and making sure the paper aligns perfectly at the top and bottom. I hold everything in place and gently make a crease at the other end. With that crease established, I can go ahead and firm it down with my bone folder. Then all I need to do is repeat the process on the other end, measuring in the same amount, and then making the crease to define the other shoulder of the spine. The result should be a spine that's perfectly centered and exactly the right width for the text block. To finish the cover, I want to fold in the front and back flaps. Doing this creates a 4-edge fold that's a little more robust than just a bare edge of paper. I'm making mine essentially the full width of the book, but these can be narrower, or you can skip this step entirely if you don't have a really big piece of paper. I like to make the front edge of the cover about 2 millimeters proud of the text block. This extra space in bookbinding is called a square. To fold the cover in the right place, I measure in my 2 millimeters from the spine fold, then I fold the cover back to meet the end of the ruler, making sure to keep the top and bottom edges of the paper even. I'll firm that crease down with my bone folder, and then repeat the process on the other side. With the cover done, it's time to lay out the sewing stations, which will also correspond to the slits we'll need to make on the spine. For this book, I'm going to have 3 equal sections of exposed sewing, and that means I need to lay out 4 individual sewing stations. I'll do that using my offcut piece from the cover. I'll measure the height of the cover, and then divide that by 5, which will give me 4 evenly spaced sewing stations. I'll make 2 marks in from one end, and then 2 from the other, and if I've mismeasured it, the difference will be in the middle, and it won't be noticeable. I'll also mark an H on the template, which denotes the head of the book, and I'll make a mark on the spine of all the signatures so that I can align them all to the same end. I'll do the same thing on the inside of the cover, and that'll be hidden when the book is done. To punch the sewing holes, I'm going to work on a piece of cardboard. I tap each signature to make sure the pages are all snug down at the fold. Then I'll insert my template, and making sure to keep it flush to the signature at the head, I hold my awl at a 45-degree angle and punch through at each sewing station. This operation can also be done using a tool called a punching cradle. I'll show you how to make one of those in a later video, so be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss it. So our sewing holes are punched, but we're not done with this template just yet. We're going to use it to lay out the slits in the cover. This operation is pretty straightforward. I'm going to open up the cover and align the head of the template with the head of the book. To make sure that the marks that I make are precise, I'm going to use my awl to prick a small hole right in the fold at each sewing station mark. And I'll do that on both sides of the spine. Then, using my knife and ruler, I'm going to make a slit between each of those pinpricks. It's important here that your cuts don't extend past the crease, otherwise they'll show on the front or back of the book. With all the parts of the book now complete, it's time to start sewing. To estimate how much thread I'll need, I measure out a length the height of the book, and do this as many times as there are signatures. I'll then double that length to account for the wraps that need to be done at the head and tail. If you're sewing an especially thick book, don't try to do it with a mile of thread. You'll just wind up with a tangled mess. Check out my video on the weaver's knot instead. Smith recommends using a heavier thread for this binding, and that it be heavily waxed. To wax my thread, I pull it between the wax and my thumb several times to give it a good coating, and then attach the needle. To prepare for sewing, I'll check the alignment marks on the text block to make sure they're aligned at the head of the book, then place them to one side. I'll fold in the flaps of my cover and place it in the center of my workspace. As I sew the book, I'll flip over one signature at a time, working from the back of the book towards the front. To begin the sewing, start at the inside of the first signature. Pass the needle through the first sewing station, then through the corresponding slit in the cover. To avoid piercing the paper cover, angle the needle a bit to approach it from the side, or use your other hand to push on one side of the slit to make a gap. At this stage, don't worry if the thread is not right down at the shoulder of the spine. That'll come later. Pull the thread through, leaving enough on the inside to tie a knot. Now bring the needle and thread around the outside of the cover, over the head of the book, and back inside the first signature. Pull the thread tight, though not so tight as to crimp the cover at the head, then secure it with a square knot at the first sewing station. You try tying a knot without getting your fingers in front of the camera. Can't be done, I tell ya. Finish the knot by trimming off the excess thread. Now pass the needle through the next sewing hole and out through the slit in the cover, then pull the thread snug. It should look something like this. Next we'll need to make a stitch going in through the outside of the cover. Slip the tip of the needle through the third slit, then open the cover and carefully guide the needle through the corresponding sewing hole. Pull your thread through and take up the slack. This binding looks best if the sewing has good tension, so try to pull the thread tight on every stitch. It's a good habit to always pull the thread in line with the spine to avoid tearing your paper. Pass the needle out through the fourth sewing station and through the cover slit. You should now be at the tail end of the book, which is also a good spot to check your sewing tension if you haven't been doing so already. The next stitch is a bit different and is the key to this binding structure. Bring the needle and thread around the tail to the inside of the signature and pass the needle through the fourth sewing station once again, but this time don't go through the cover slit. Doing so will prepare for the upcoming hidden link stitch. Before we do that though, I like to take an extra step that isn't in the original instructions, but which through experience I've found is really helpful. With the book flat on the bench, I hold the spine of the book upright, then using my folder, I press firmly down along the fold of the signature. This embeds the thread slightly into the paper and reduces the overall thickness of the signature. I found it goes a long way to helping all the pages fit inside the cover. With that done, I can now add the next signature. Because I didn't sew through the cover on the previous stitch, the thread is in place to link up to the next signature. I'll pass the needle through the sewing station at the tail end of the new signature and take up any slack. Next, I bring the needle and thread back down to the tail and around the outside of the cover, then through the slit and back through the fourth sewing station once again. This stitch effectively links the two signatures together, as well as securing the new signature to the cover. Check that the wraparound at the tail hasn't overlapped with the previous one, which can happen pretty easily. The exposed stitches should all be parallel, but don't worry if the spacing is off at this stage. As signatures get added and the sewing gets packed in, things should straighten out. With the second signature attached, it's now a simple matter of going in and out through the sewing stations and the cover until you reach the other end of the second signature. Once again, when you reach the outside of the head of the book, bring the needle and thread around the outside of the cover to the inside of the signature, pass the needle through the first sewing station, but remember to set up for the link stitch by not sewing through the cover. Once again, check your tension, then compress the signatures at the fold using your folder. When doing this, be careful to press only on the signature so as not to tear the cover. If your folder has a square end, I've found it helps give a little more control. The rest of the sewing is straightforward. Follow the same sewing pattern for every signature of your book, making sure to form your link stitch at the head and tail of every signature, and try to firm down each one as you go. Here's some general tips while we let the sewing montage play. When pulling your sewing snug, it helps to raise the spine of the book to a 90-degree angle to make sure that everything is sitting properly in place. As the sewing progresses, you'll find the binding becoming tighter, and it can become a challenge to sneak the needle between the back of the signature and the cover for the link stitch. If this is the case for you, try keeping the needle flat against the inside of the text block and angle it towards the outside of the book while gently bending back the spine paper. This should give just enough clearance to get the needle through. Doing this may loosen the sewing a bit, but that can be snugged up once you've got the needle clear. As you approach the end of your sewing, you may find you don't have quite enough room left for the last signature. If that happens, you can simply leave it out and finish off the book right where you are. On the other hand, you may find you've got a lot of extra space left. If that happens, prepare a few more signatures to fill up your book. You may then find, though, that you don't have quite enough thread on your needle to finish, in which case, check out my weaver's knot video. When adding the final signature, make sure the final wraparound stitch is positioned on the spine and not caught on the cover of the book. Okay, we're almost done, and finishing off the sewing is easy. At the final stitch, bring the needle and thread over the head of the book to form the final wraparound, and tie it off inside at the first sewing station to secure it, doing your best to maintain tension on the thread. Trim the thread close to the knot, and the sewing is complete. The last things you want to do are to firm down the final signature with your folder to discourage it from springing open too much. And if you find the edges of the spine slits have been bruised by the needle, use the tip of your folder to gently push the paper back into place. And with that, your book is finished and ready to use. The instant gratification you get upon completion is one of the things I like the most about this binding. This kind of book is also well suited to almost unlimited variations. You can make a skinny book or a thick book or anything in between, with any combination of cover material or thread that you like. Maybe try varying the number or spacing of your sewing stations for a more creative effect on the spine. The design's entirely up to you. That's all for today. I've had a lot of fun learning this binding myself, and I hope you did too, so I'm glad I was able to share it with you. If you found this video useful, then please give it a like and consider subscribing. It really does grow the channel and helps new people discover the fun of bookbinding. If you'd like to support me directly, the best way to do that is to simply buy me a coffee. You'll find a link in the video description. Cheers! If you want to learn more about bookbinding, check out some of my other beginner videos, and be sure to ring the notification bell so you don't miss any of my new installments. That's all for today, so thanks a lot for watching. Once again, I'm Dennis, and I'll see you in the next video. Happy binding!